Amen. Now, the last few years have seen a pretty eventful circumstances. And one of the things that we've seen in our society in the last several years is we've seen an idea of justice, a quest for justice, you might say. And some notable things here. Hopefully they'll come up here and you'll be able to see some notable things that we've seen in our society today. And please don't misunderstand, as always, I'm not trying to make political statements here, so that's not really the issue. This is more just a question of what is relevant to the topic at hand. But this idea of justice, we've seen a great push for this. People who will go out into the streets and protest and raise their voices seeking justice and standing up together trying to assert the need for justice. That's what they keep talking about. Of course, we've seen that the cries for justice oftentimes result in other things as well. Destruction of property. That was not just in Minneapolis, by the way, those are pictures from Minneapolis, but then there was some closer to home. You might remember this was the same year. This was Kenosha, Wisconsin, so just down the road from us here, back in 2020. And again, the cries for justice, the pursuit of justice, well, it involved some other things as well that may or may not have been related to justice. And we saw those kind of things happening as well. Of course, that same year, if you could extend it on to the end of that year and on into the beginning of 2021, then we ended up seeing a bunch of people protesting at the U.S. Capitol in January of 2021, and people who were outraged about political events, and so they were trying to make their voices known. And of course, a lot of people together, emotions run high, and what happened in some ways akin to the things that happened in the other instances. And all of this in the pursuit of, or at least professed to be in the pursuit of justice, right? Now, this is even much more recent, so this is just in the last couple of weeks. We continue to see the same kind of concerns, the same kinds of issues, and same kind of cries for justice, so-called. And probably don't read all the things that are written in all the signs or whatever. I don't know. I didn't vet all those completely, probably, but not really the point. But the subject of justice is what comes to mind, because as we look again at the book of Proverbs, and coming back to the theme, I told you last week we addressed the subject of righteousness and wickedness in the book of Proverbs. It's a major theme that runs through the whole book, this theme of righteousness and wickedness. And how do we identify the righteous person? How do we pursue being a righteous person? What does that look like? What is the result? Where does righteousness lead? Where does wickedness lead? We looked at some of that last week. Well, today I want to kind of draw our attention to two what we might call sub-points, I guess, or kind of themes that I would put under the umbrella of this subject of righteousness and wickedness in the book of Proverbs. And these are two kind of more specialized areas. And then one of them has to do with this issue of justice. Right? And specifically this principle from the book of Proverbs, that righteous ones pursue justice. Right? It's righteous to pursue justice. This is something that the Bible speaks about. The book of Proverbs specifically is righteous to pursue justice. Now, I'll prove that here in shortly, but the key, and I think as we're discussing this, even from the pictures that I showed you, maybe this would come to your mind, and it should at some point come to your mind, to ask a simple question. Right? Because if we're going to talk about justice, do those pictures represent the pursuit of justice? The signs, if you look at least some of them anyways, at least indicated that it was the pursuit of justice. The people were in the streets protesting and organizing and gathering, which again, our Constitution guarantees the right of people to peaceably assemble so that we can petition our government for the redress of grievances. That's how it's actually worded in the Constitution, if you want to read that sometime. It's a good idea if you haven't read it recently to do that again. But the issue here is that what it looks like to seek justice? Does justice result from that? Do we see an increase in justice in our society when people take to the streets to protest or to seek justice in that way? And I think that's a legitimate question. And we need to look at what the Bible says, because here's the problem. There's all sorts of ideas about justice and what justice means. A lot of people think justice has to do with equality, with everyone having the same thing and everyone ending up in the same place and everyone all having success together, and that's justice. Other people include ideas of reparations and paying back wrongs, sometimes from generations ago, and different things. But what does the Bible say about justice? How does the Bible define it? So this is really what we want to start with. And I want to kind of examine this because I think the principle is important. Righteous ones pursue justice. If we are going to be men and women of righteousness, we have to pursue justice. We need to prioritize justice. We need to value justice. But what is it? How do we know? And what does it look like? Well, let's take a look at that for a minute. And the book of Proverbs is a great place for us to do this. So we're going to walk through this. So what does the Bible mean by justice? Right? Well, the easiest way I can do to illustrate this is we're going to look at the opposite side of the coin first. Okay? What is injustice? According to the book of Proverbs. That's why we're in Proverbs chapter 17. Right? So look with me, Proverbs chapter 17, and start in we're just going to look at verse 15. Proverbs 17 and verse 15. What does it say? He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the just, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord. Now let's stop and think about this for just a second. Who is in the position, you guys are going to have to help me, kind of just give me some feedback here, but who is in the position to, as he says here, justify the wicked and condemn the just? What person is he talking about here? What's that? Okay, but what's that? Okay, well, no, it's true. God is a judge, right? Right? But is that what the focus is here? Is God going to justify the wicked and condemn the just? Is that God's judgment? He says that the one who does that is an abomination to the Lord. So who is actually the one that's in view here who is doing the condemning or the justifying here in this verse? Okay, a human judge, right? A human judge is making this judgment, looking at a person who is wicked and saying, no, he's righteous, declaring him to be righteous. Looking at a person who is innocent, who's righteous, and condemning him, right? A person who's innocent is being wrongly accused and condemned. So this is a human judge. Now let's stop and think for a second. The book of Proverbs. Who wrote the book of Proverbs again? What's that? Okay. I know there's not very many of you here today, but you got to help me out, okay? So who wrote the book of Proverbs again? Solomon. Okay. So what was Solomon's title? What was his position? What's that? He was king. Okay. He was king. I'm trying to give you easy questions here to answer. Okay, so these are easy ones to get right. Where was he king? In Israel, in Jerusalem, okay, over the nation of Israel. So Solomon is the king over the nation of Israel. He's writing the book of Proverbs. Who's Solomon writing the book of Proverbs for? his son. Why on earth would Solomon, the king, be writing a book of wisdom to his son? What is his son's position? Yeah, he's the next king, right? He's coming up. He's the prince who's going to become the next king. Do you think the king who's coming needs to know how to be a good judge? Yeah. So I mean, this makes perfect sense in the book of Proverbs. Why would Proverbs talk about this issue of justice and injustice? Because it's a book by a king written to his son who's going to be king someday. And a king is really the chief judge of the nation. He's the one who's going to make the final decision about matters in his country. And he needs to know how to make the right decisions. Because a lot of things are riding on the king being a good judge, right? So that's true. So that's why I think in the context here of the book of Proverbs, why this theme comes up, this issue of justice. And we're going to see that this is actually, there's quite a bit that Proverbs has to say about this. But right here in chapter 17, verse 15, this is a warning here. It's a warning to a judge, a king. But the warning is what? It's if you justify the wicked, right? Someone who is objectively wicked, objectively sinful. This is somebody who is clearly someone who has violated the law, someone who has done wrong, but you justify them. What does it mean to justify them? Well, in a legal context, this word justify, this idea of justifying in legal context means to declare someone to be righteous, innocent. So this is a judge looking at somebody who is obviously guilty and saying, nope, he's innocent. That's a travesty of justice. And on the other hand, he's condemning the just. Again, a just person is a person who's righteous, who's upright. But a judge is saying, condemn him, put him to death, execute this guy because, why? Because he's righteous? Okay. This is, again, a travesty. This is to pervert or twist justice. This is an injustice. How would we classify this? Well, this is, I would say this way, that injustice, the first instance here, is calling evil good and good evil. Isn't that what he's doing? What the judge is doing. If he condemns an innocent man and he justifies, declares innocent a guilty man, he is calling evil good and good evil. Does this ever happen? Today? Of course it does. This is very relevant today because this happens today as well. Okay, let's turn over to Proverbs 18, verse 5. Maybe you're close to that. Proverbs 18, verse 5. Another proverb that gives the same principle here. It is not good to show partiality to the wicked or to overthrow the righteous in judgment. What is partiality? Well, depending on what Bible version you're using, it might use the word favoritism there. That's what partiality means. It's being partial. It's playing favorites. Okay? And a judge is supposed to be impartial, right? He's not supposed to take a side. Right? If you look at the way this works in our own courts, well, that's just the way it's supposed to work in our own courts, is that if a judge is sitting there at the bench and he has a case come before him, and let's say the judge has a case come before him, somebody's accused of a crime, and the guy that's accused of a crime is a family member of the judge. Well, what is the judge supposed to do in that situation? Yeah, he's supposed to recuse himself. He's supposed to step aside and say, no, I have an unfair perspective here because I have a relationship to this guy and I can't be even-handed. I can't be balanced, right? I can't be impartial because I've got a vested interest in the life of this individual, right? Or, again, whatever the circumstances are. But the point is, if the judge has some sort of personal attachment to the case, then he's supposed to say, you know what? Another judge has got to make this decision. I can't do it. Now, obviously, if you're the king, how can the king recuse himself? Okay, because he's the chief one. So he really can't recuse himself. But I think the principle here is that we're supposed to have judges who are even-handed, right? They don't have their hand on one side of the scale and making it unfair. No, the judge is supposed to be impartial. And here again in verse 5, chapter 18, it's not good to show partiality to the wicked. So why would a judge be partial to the wicked? Because he's calling evil good and good evil. He is perverting good and evil. That's why he'd be partial for the wicked. Oh, and overthrowing the just. This is the same thing. This is somebody who is calling evil good and good evil. And again, I mean, if we're applying this in the context of a court setting, is this still a problem today? And the answer is yes. Still very much a problem today, just as much as it was in Solomon's day, which is why Solomon was warning his son about it. Because he needed to know that this is unacceptable in a judge, in a king. All right, let's turn over to one more, chapter 24. And in chapter 24, beginning of verse 23, we'll read down a couple of verses here. Verse 23, these things also belong to the wise. It is not good to show partiality in judgment. Same exact thing we just read. He who says to the wicked, you are righteous, him the people will curse. Nations will abhor him. But those who rebuke the wicked will have delight, and a good blessing will come upon them. He who gives a right answer kisses the lips. But the idea here, I think this is so important for us to understand. Again, this issue of partiality, of favoritism on the part of a judge, calling good evil and evil good. It's wrong. Okay, verse 23 says it's not good. Verse 24 says, if you do this, that people will curse you. Nations will abhor you. They will hate you. Because you are a corrupter. You are someone who is perpetrating injustice. So if you do this, you are perpetrating injustice. Of course, verse 26, I think, is giving us the other side, or verses 25 and 26 are giving us the other side of the coin here, okay, which would suggest to us that obviously the opposite of this is what we ought to do, right? Call evil, evil. Call good, good. So in verse 25, it's rebuking the wicked, right? Rebuking the wicked, calling out the wicked for their wickedness, calling it what it is. And the result of that is you'll have delight and blessing. This is what he means in verse 26, this idea of giving a right answer as somebody who speaks, what they're saying, what they're declaring about it is consistent with what it is. So you're giving a right answer because you're calling good, good. And you're calling evil, evil. And because you do that, it's like a kiss on the lips. It's not really, this is not like meant to be a romantic thing. It's simply saying it's favorable. It's something that's good. It's something that produces goodwill and something that gets a good response. Right? Because you say what is true. You call evil, evil. You call good, good. So injustice is when we get that backwards. All right? Let's go back to chapter 17 because there's another kind of injustice that the book of Proverbs warns us about. By the way, we will see in just a minute that this is not restricted only to the king and his son. So you say, well, I'm not a king, I'm not a prince, I'm not a judge. Okay, well, that's true, but these principles definitely apply beyond that, okay? So we'll just bear with me on that. But chapter 17, verse 26, he says this, also, to punish the righteous is not good, nor to strike princes for their uprightness. And this is similar to the previous one. I would say this is punishing the innocent. Right? Punishing the innocent is a form of injustice. And he says here, it's not right to do that. It's not right to punish the righteous. And I think there's an element here, there may be an element here, a sense in which the king or the judge needs to do his due diligence. needs to make sure that he's not punishing the innocent along with the guilty. Sometimes the court or the judge doesn't do a very good job of identifying who's really at fault and making sure they get punished, and the people who are not really truly at fault don't they get kind of caught up in it. And sometimes they end up getting punished for things they're really not guilty of. I mean, even as, well, again, to take this outside of the realm of that kind of judgment, even as parents, sometimes it's a challenge. Now, if you're a parent and you only have one child, it's not really difficult because you don't have to do a whole lot of, he said, she said kind of stuff, okay? But once you start having more kids than that, and especially once you get 3 or more, then it's just, all bets are off, okay? And you have to play like chief investigator all the time, right? But I think this proverb would tell us that that's what we ought to do, because it's important to make sure that we're not punishing our children when they aren't doing something that deserves discipline, right? We need to be careful that we exercise this faithfully and carefully. We practice good judgment. Right? And the same thing is true in a church. Does a church ever have to pass judgment? Yes. I know a lot of churches don't like doing that, and so a lot of churches don't anymore. They don't exercise any kind of discipline. They just let people do whatever they want, come and go as they please. But that's not a biblical view of the church. Biblical view of the church, there's accountability. Church members are accountable to the body. Each one of us is accountable to the body. And in that situation, the church sometimes has to investigate and do our due diligence to make sure that we're not censuring those who are innocent. Because punishing the innocent is a form of injustice. All right? Go to chapter 20 then. Here's another kind of injustice that we see. Chapter 20, beginning in verse 9, he says, "Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? Diverse weights and diverse measures, they are both alike an abomination to the Lord. Even a child is known by his deeds, whether what he does is pure and right." Now these 3 proverbs may not seem to fit together, but I think that there is a sense of that these do fit together. And the central theme is this idea of dishonesty or cheating, right? Of course, is anyone truly innocent? Can any of us claim to be pure from sin? In verse 9, no. In fact, he identifies an area where this would be a common problem in verse 10, this idea of diverse weights, diverse measures. I've explained this to the kids before when we've read through this. In fact, we just read this in Deuteronomy where it gave a prohibition about this in the law. But to understand how they would measure things, the idea of diverse weights, often you'd measure out things by weight. We still do that today, but we don't take scales with us to the grocery store. Maybe you do, I don't know. Probably don't. Take a scale with you to the grocery store and put that bag of flour on there, make sure it actually weighs what it says it weighs, Put that jug of oil on there. Oh yeah, it does weigh what it says it weighs, that kind of thing. We measure that by volume. But anyways, but the point is that we measure, we don't take our own scales with us. We don't take our own containers and go, well, I know this container is exactly 1 liter, so I'm going to just pour that oil into here and see if it's exactly 1 liter. Okay, now I'll buy the oil. No, we don't do that, right? We trust, I don't know who we trust in that, right? Do you trust the grocery store? Probably shouldn't. Do you trust the manufacturer? Probably shouldn't. Do you trust the government? Because at least ostensibly the government is looking out for us in this. Again, this kind of comes back to the same principle here that Solomon is writing to his son. He's the king, and the king is responsible to make sure that justice is done. And so it's unjust when someone uses a dishonest measuring tool, right? So you go to buy that 2x4 at the lumber yard, and he says it's an 8-footer. You put your tape measure on it, and it's actually 2 inches short. Right? Well, that's not an 8-footer. But he might be able to shave a little bit, might be able to get a little bit more money by shaving down the size of what he's doing, right? Or you're buying that, pumping that gallon of gas in your car. You have any way of knowing whether that's actually a gallon or not? Well, you're trusting that sticker on the pump that says that the Bureau of Weights and Measures in the state of Wisconsin has inspected that pump, and it's up to date. And therefore, they've tested it, they've approved it, and you know it's the right size. But the point is that if they were dishonest, if they were dishonest, they could give you, a couple of ounces less than a gallon. And you wouldn't know. And they charge you the full price. And they get a little more money out of you, right? And then that's the problem that Solomon points out here. This is an issue. Cheating in business. What's interesting, in the next verse, he says, even a child is known by his deeds. Right? I think the emphasis is that it doesn't matter what somebody says. Right? People protest their honesty all the time, you know. And I know, I don't want to pick on anybody, but I know if you go to the car dealership to buy a car, and you know, sometimes you go to the car dealership to buy a car, and that salesman is not really honest. And he's not telling you everything that he knows about that vehicle. Because he's trying to get you to pay for it, but he knows that in reality what you're buying is not worth what you're paying for it. And there's so many areas in which this could apply, but the point here is that using diverse weights, diverse measures, dishonest scales, he says here in verse 10, these are an abomination to the Lord. In other words, God hates this when we practice dishonest business practices. And you can protest your innocence all you want, but even a child has a reputation based not on what he says, but what he does. How much more the business owner? I think that's the implication here. Even a child can gain a reputation for honesty by doing what's right. But words don't count for much if your actions are dishonest, and that's the issue here. Are we honest in business? Are we honest in in our dealings? Verse 23, same chapter, repeats the same, very, very similarly. Diverse weights are an abomination to the Lord, and dishonest scales are not good. So this is another kind of injustice, cheating in business. All right, let's go to chapter 25. One more kind of injustice to identify here. Proverbs 25, verse 18. A man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow. A man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow. Well, what's a club for? What's a sword going to do? What's an arrow? These are all weapons that produce real harm. You know, I know we have the saying that we use on the playground with kids, you know, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me, or whatever. And in one sense, that may be true. Words aren't physically painful. However, Proverbs is saying that bearing false witness, in other words, slandering, lying about someone in order to get them in trouble, that's the purpose of bearing false witness, right? It's saying something with the purpose of getting that person in trouble, saying something with the purpose of causing harm to them. He says it's like a club. He says you might as well use a club, a sword, or an arrow, because you're actively pursuing the harm of another person. This is an injustice, bearing false witness. These are all different forms of injustice. Again, do we see them today? Yeah, we see them today in our court system, but we see them in our society in general. Sometimes we even see them in the church with Christians, professing Christians, who justify their own sin by calling evil good and good evil, and twist that around. Sometimes we see Christians punishing the innocent. We see Christians cheating in business. It's shameful, but it happens. We see Christians bearing false witness. This is injustice. This is exactly the thing that Solomon is telling his son needs to be stamped out. Because it's not fit for a king. But let's look on the other side. Then if that's how we can define injustice according to Proverbs, how do we define justice? What does it say about that? Well, turn with me to chapter 24, verse 11. Chapter 24, verse 11 gives us a little bit of an indication here of what it means to exercise justice. You might recognize this when you see it. Deliver those who are drawn toward death and hold back those stumbling to the slaughter. If you say, surely we did not know this, does not he who weighs the hearts consider it? He who keeps your soul, does he not know it? And will he not render to each man according to his deeds? What is justice? Well, one thing that justice is protecting the weak. He says specifically here, those who are stumbling to the slaughter. This is, they are going to their death. And you, he says, of course, Solomon to his son, deliver them, protect them, hold them back, keep them from coming to harm. Now he says, you might have an excuse. You might say, well, I didn't know. You might plead ignorance here in the next verse. You might say, well, I didn't know it was going to end up that way. I didn't know that was going to happen. But here's the warning he says, does not he who weighs the hearts consider it? Well, here's the question. Who weighs the hearts? Now, I know our court system foolishly thinks that it can weigh the heart. Okay? If you don't believe me, then just look at the fact that we have enacted laws that are called hate crime laws. What is hate? It's a state of the heart. So we have laws on the books that make it a crime to have your heart hate someone. I mean, really. So we can enact hate crime penalties on crimes because we say, well, that's our court system trying to weigh the hearts. And it never works, okay? Because, listen, every time somebody kills somebody else, I think we could argue that it's a hate crime. Okay? Because you don't kill somebody because you love them, right? But the point here is that it's missing. Who's the one who actually weighs the hearts? Who's the one who knows? Well, it's God. And Solomon says, here's the thing. You can say, I didn't know. You can say, I didn't know where that was going to end up. I didn't know they were going to die. I didn't know they were going that way. I'm not responsible because I didn't know. And he says, don't try to play it off. Don't use that as an excuse because God considers. He who keeps your soul. Who is it that keeps your soul? Again, it's God. God is the one who knows. He will render to each man according to his deeds. So in other words, to you who sit in judgment, you're responsible to protect the weak. But if you don't do it, you will be held accountable. Right? Go to chapter 29 and verse 7. We see the same principle again. Chapter 29, verse 7. The righteous considers the cause of the poor, but the wicked does not understand such knowledge. Again, the righteous looks at the cause of the poor. Now, you have to realize that when we're talking about the poor, when Solomon is talking about the poor, he's not talking about poor Americans living on welfare. He's talking about people who are destitute. Right? There was no welfare system in Israel like there is in the United States. And he's talking about the cause of the poor. The poor here are those who are the most vulnerable. Often, the poor were the widows, the fatherless, because the father was the one who could protect the family and provide for the family. And if he was gone out of the picture, the family was often left with almost nothing. And there's several instances of that in the Bible. We see it. But the righteous one considers the cause of the poor. The righteous one is actively looking to protect those who are weak and vulnerable, which is exactly what the poor are described as here. The wicked does not even understand this. It does not even enter into his mind to think about the cause and the need of the poor. Right? But the righteous one, he stands up for justice, protecting the weak. Go back to chapter 25 then. There's another aspect of justice, chapter 25 and verse 26. Chapter 25, verse 26. This is an interesting picture. A righteous man who falters before the wicked is like a murky spring in a polluted well. And that word falters there, again, depending on what translation you use, Some of them have the idea here of somebody who gives way, somebody who yields to the wicked. And again, what's the implication here? The picture is of somebody who instead of standing up to the wicked, he gives way. This is somebody who's a coward, somebody who backs down instead of standing up and fighting for what's right. And what is he? Well, he describes him, he's like a murky spring or a polluted well. So what happens when a spring gets polluted? What happens when it gets corrupted? Well, you can't drink it. It's no good. You have to wait for that spring to purify itself. I'm not sure if you can really purify a well. I've never tried that before. I don't know. The point is that it turns it into, it's good for nothing. You can't drink it. You can't use it. It's not good for anything at all. It's again, this is the problem. And so what is the righteous supposed to do? What is he expected to do? What is justice? It's standing against the wicked. There's an element here of boldness and courage that needs to be in the heart of the man or woman of righteousness. That we would stand up for what's right and we would stand against that which is wrong. And if we yield to that, if we give in, it's like polluting a spring, poisoning a well. It's good for nothing. Let's keep going. What else is justice in Proverbs? Well, the next 2 points here are not really identifying what justice is exactly, but more talking about what justice is worth, what makes it important. And the first is justice is more important than money. Justice is more important than money. Look at chapter 16 and verse 8. He says, "Better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice." Better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Now it's interesting because on one hand, we know this is true, right? And just watch almost any kind of popular media, right? Watch movies, television, whatever, and read stories, and all of the stories that we tell. You have this guy that's rich, but he's unjust. He's rich, but he's gotten rich because he's cruel and he's dishonest. And if most of the time, he's going to get it in the end, right? Because the guy who may not have a lot, but he's righteous, he's the upright guy, he's going to be victorious. He's the cowboy with the white hat, and the guy with the black hat is the one that is dishonest. Okay. When that stereotype is pretty well established, and we follow that, right? It's it's a biblical concept. That it's more important to have justice than to have money. It's more important to pursue justice than to pursue wealth. Now, it's not saying that it's wrong to be wealthy. That's where, again, sometimes our society misses it. Because we look at anybody who's wealthy and we say, well, they must be corrupt. They must be dishonest. But that's not the case, according to the book of Proverbs. The man who's wealthy is not necessarily corrupt. The problem is if he is corrupt, his wealth does him no good. Better to be poor and have justice than to pursue wealth but do it unjustly. This is stated a couple of other places. Look at chapter 17, verse 23. And again, we can see the application here to the king or the king's son. Chapter 17, verse 23. A wicked man accepts a bribe behind the back to pervert the ways of justice. He values money more than he values justice, and so he accepts a bribe and he allows it to twist him so that he comes to the wrong judgment. And then look at chapter 28 and verse 6. Again, better is the poor who walks in his integrity than one perverse in his ways, though he be rich. You do have to remember this too, because in the Israelite society, in the Old Testament economy of God, we read through the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and often God would say that His plan was to bless Israel. His plan was to make them prosperous and successful. And so if you're not careful, and I think what happened with some of the Israelites is they began to think that the material blessing and prosperity was a sign that God was pleased with them. The Proverbs is warning us that sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we have a man who's poor, who has nothing materially, but he has integrity. He stands for righteousness, and he's upright, and he stands for justice. And sometimes the rich is somebody who didn't get there because God blessed him. He got there because he was dishonest, and he's unjust. And which of those is to be preferred? Well, honesty, integrity, justice is preferred. It's more important than money. But you know something else that justice is more important than? It's not just money, but also religion. Justice is more important than religion. Look at chapter 21. Chapter 21, verses 3 and 4. He says this, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. A haughty look, a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin. So, you say, well, can you make up for your injustice by coming to church and giving large offerings? No, you can't. You can't offer sacrifices to God and somehow make it okay that you are oppressing others, that you are mistreating them, that you are practicing injustice. In fact, the book of James talks about this. James says that there were people in the church who were rich, who were refusing to pay their day laborers, who were poor, who were depending on each day's pay to be able to provide food. And the rich were withholding their wages. And James says, you are killing them. You are being unjust. James condemns them for it. It's exactly what this is talking about here. Well, you're going to come to the church and you're going to be all pious and act like a religious, but in the rest of your life, you are practicing injustice. You're mistreating the poor. You're taking advantage of others. Guess what? God doesn't want your sacrifices. God doesn't want your worship, quote unquote. If you're not going to stand up for what's right, if you're not going to do what's right, if you're not going to pursue justice, God doesn't care about your sacrifices. God doesn't care about the time you spend in church. God doesn't care about the things that you do or say supposedly in a religious venue. If your heart is not right before Him, if you're practicing injustice, He doesn't care. It's very important that we understand that. Unfortunately, sometimes even in churches this happens, where somebody who is wealthy and influential, maybe somebody who's been a part of the church for a long time and they've got significant influence, and they act in ways that are wrong, they practice injustice, and yet it's ignored, it's dismissed because they're a pillar of the community, they're a core part of the church. And that's wrong. We need to call out injustice. We need to rebuke it because it's more important to practice justice than it is to practice religion. Okay, one more principle here as we kind of wrap this up. This idea of justice is the duty of all those in authority. I think this is where we see this. It's not just the king, although it does certainly belong to the king. And that's the context that Solomon's going to talk about here. Chapter 16, verse 12. We'll start there. Chapter 16, verse 12, he says, it is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. I think it's interesting that he says that. A throne is established by righteousness. How does a king establish his throne? How does a king rule? You say, well, he's the king. He rules because he's the king. He rules because his family is the royal family or whatever. Okay? Well, actually, Solomon says his throne is established, his throne is strengthened, his throne is founded upon righteousness, justice. This is the responsibility of someone in authority. And it establishes his authority. That's how the king has authority, because he exercises justice. If you have a king that doesn't exercise justice, if you have a king and you go to him and you have a right, your neighbor has wronged you, and you go to the king and you say, King, I need help. My neighbor has wronged me. He's abusing me. He's taking advantage of me. I need help. And the king says, I don't care. What good has the king done? What good is his authority? Nothing. And the first opportunity you have to get a new king, you'd be all over it. One of the advantages of having a system like we have, because we can vote out our king every 4 years. I know he's not really a king, but they act like it. We can vote him out every 4 years, right? Replace him with somebody else that might, maybe, possibly listen and do what we want. Okay? But the point is that's how his authority is established. And if he does not exercise justice, he undermines his own authority. And this is true of anyone in a position of authority, not just a king. Again, this is true if you're a parent. If you're a parent, your authority as a parent is established by righteousness, by you doing what's right. Your kids will see you. They'll know because they observe you. They know if you do what's right in your personal life. And they know that, and that will have a dynamic effect on how they respond to your authority. Do you actually believe what you say you believe? Do you live like it? Do you submit to God? Do you obey? Are you a person who pursues righteousness in your own life? If so, then your authority as a parent will be established by that. But you undermine your authority if you live in disobedience to the Word of God. Okay, how about chapter 25, verse 5? We'll just kind of rapidly go through. There's a couple more verses here I want to hit on this theme before we move on. Chapter 25, verse 5. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness. Same principle there. The establishment of the king's throne because of righteousness. Go to chapter 28. Chapter 28, verse 12. When the righteous rejoice, there is great glory, but when the wicked arise, men hide themselves. He who covers his sins will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. Happy is the man who is always reverent, but he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity. Like a roaring lion and a charging bear is a wicked ruler over poor people. A ruler who lacks understanding is a great oppressor, but he who hates covetousness will prolong his days. The importance here of anyone in a position of authority and leadership to have integrity, to pursue righteousness. Look at the illustration. The person who doesn't have integrity, the person who doesn't pursue justice, who's in a position of authority, what is he like? He's like a roaring lion or a charging bear. What's the end result of the roaring lion and the charging bear? Destruction, death, pain, sorrow, loss. That's exactly what you can expect. If you and I, when we are in positions of authority, if we do not pursue justice, then we become like a roaring lion and a charging bear. You want to destroy the people who are under you? Listen, if you're in a position in business where you're in management, you can destroy, you can ruin, you can create havoc in the lives of people that you are supervising by being like a charging bear. Somebody who doesn't pursue justice, who doesn't do what's right, somebody who exercises all of these other things we talked about, injustice. As a parent, in the church, so many places which this applies. Any place that we have authority. Same chapter 28. Look down at verse 28. When the wicked arise, men hide themselves, but when they perish, the righteous increase. And chapter 29, verse 2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. I actually had a whole nother section to talk about. We're just not even going to get to that today. This has not happened in a while, but that's what Book of Proverbs is doing to me, so it's okay. Let's just close with this. I want to just bring this kind of together here. I want to contrast man's view of justice and God's view. A lot of people today, again, a lot of people talk about pursuing justice. But what really happens? Rubber meets the road. What is it actually like? Turn to chapter 21. What is the perspective of men when it comes to this issue of justice? Chapter 21, verse 15. It is a joy for the just to do justice, but destruction will come to the workers of iniquity. It is a joy for the just to do justice. What does he mean by that? Well, I think what he means is when you yourself have integrity, when you yourself are living upright, then exercising justice is not difficult. In fact, it's a joy to do. But think about the opposite. What is it if the judge who's passing judgment is himself guilty of the crime? What do we call that? When the judge who's passing judgment is guilty of the crime, what do we call that? What's that? Yeah, hypocrisy. He's a hypocrite. And listen, what does Jesus say? Jesus says the same thing. Matthew chapter 7, one of the most famous verses to be taken out of context in all the Bible. Judge not, lest you be not judged. But if you read the whole context, what does Jesus say? Jesus says, when you pass judgment, you need to pass judgment on yourself first. Take that big log out of your eye, and then you can see that speck of dirt in your brother's eye, and you can pick it out of it. He's not saying don't pick the dirt out of your brother's eye. Of course he's got something there. You got to pick it out. But you deal with yourself first. Because the issue is hypocritical judgment. That's the issue. And that's what he's saying here. You see, when we have integrity, when we are men and women of righteousness, then we can practice justice. We can pursue justice. But it starts with ourselves. This is why so many of the calls for justice in our society today are misguided, because they're calls being made by people who themselves are not interested in justice. Not really. Their own lives show that. They're not really interested in doing what's right. They're just interested in making sure that they end up on the top of the heap. And the call for justice is simply a means to get there for them. Proverbs says that's wrong. Destruction will come to the workers of iniquity. But let's turn one more verse here, 28. Chapter 28 and verses 4 and 5. Because here, again, I think this is what we see oftentimes. Man's view of justice. What does justice look like in the world today? Chapter 28, verse 4. He says, those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but such as keep the law contend with them. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all. Look at that first line. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked. Right? When someone is praising the wicked, that should tell you something about that person. What does this say? It indicates that they are probably themselves forsaking the law. They are probably themselves guilty. Right? When you were a kid, when I was a kid, maybe you had this experience too. I have 3 brothers and a sister, although she was younger, so we didn't really have as much with her, but more with my brothers. You know, a lot of times it was just nice to know if I was going to get in trouble, I had to make sure one of my brothers was in trouble too, right? You understand? Like, it was just good to have company in that. So I wasn't going down alone, you know? And so, but that's kind of the idea, right? Is that there's a sense here of praising the wicked. Because I'm guilty, right? So I'm gonna declare, again, this is exactly, this goes back to the beginning, calling evil good and good evil. Because I'm praising the wicked because I myself am guilty. On the other hand, those who keep the law contend. Those who keep the law stand up against injustice. So there's a difference here. There's a matter of integrity here. But we look at the world around us and we see this, again, this is the reality. So many of the calls for justice today are spoken by people who don't want justice. Because if they got justice, they themselves would be guilty. They themselves are guilty. They would be condemned. They don't want justice. But it's a call. We have to recognize that. We should see through that. Now that doesn't, and this is important, because it might be really easy for us to look, even those pictures I showed you at the beginning, it might be easy for us to look at those things and say, well, then we can just dismiss all of that because those people are hypocrites. They don't really want justice. Well, I think that's true to an extent in many of those cases. There's a lot of politicians and people getting rich off of that stuff. Okay? But we need to recognize the book of Proverbs says that if we believe in what's right and wrong, if we want to be men and women of righteousness, we need to stand up against injustice. We should be at the forefront of calling for the wicked to be condemned. We should be the forefront of calling for the legal system to do its job and rightfully find people guilty who've committed crimes. We should be doing that. We should be the first ones to call out sin within our own congregation when we see it in the church. I'm not saying we should be heresy hunters or we should be on the lookout constantly spying and trying to. I'm saying when we know that something wrong is being done, we should be the first ones to speak because we value justice. We should be receptive to this in our own lives as Christians. This is what should make us responsive when someone confronts us with our own sin, because we value justice and we want to see what's right upheld. Even if that means that we are the ones who are guilty, we need to value this. That needs to be our attitude. That's the call here of the book of Proverbs. But here's the thing, and again, does justice happen? Does justice happen in the world today? Do the really bad people ever really get caught? Well, most of the time it seems like no. But what does the book of Proverbs say about that? Well, let's look at that and we'll close with this. Chapter 21, verse 7. The violence of the wicked will destroy them because they refuse to do justice. The violence of the wicked will destroy them. Now this is interesting, and I think we don't have time to unpack fully, but how does this work? The violence of the wicked man undoes him. The violence of the wicked man is what destroys him. How does that work? Well, I think it's because God has designed the world to operate in this way. And there is an ultimate sense of justice. Look at chapter 22, verse 16. Who ensures that that is the case? Proverbs 22, 16. He who oppresses the poor to increase his riches, and he who gives to the rich will surely come to poverty. All right, well, twice now we have assurances here in the book of Proverbs that the person who does injustice gets his own reward for that. In other words, that he'll pay for it. How does that work? How does that happen? Well, look with me at chapter 23, verses 10 and 11, as here we see the example of how this actually works out. Do not remove the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless. Again, this has to do with the idea of moving somebody's boundary marker on their property. Okay? That stake that's in the corner, buried in your property somewhere in the corner of your lawn, digging it up and moving it a few feet over so that you can claim some of your neighbor's property. Okay? That's the kind of thing he's talking about here. Don't do that, he says, especially in the field of the fatherless. Remember, the fatherless is somebody who's most vulnerable. Why? Verse 11, for their Redeemer is mighty. He will plead their cause against you. Who is the Redeemer here? Well, this word Redeemer, you might be familiar with it from the book of Ruth, by the way. The Redeemer. That's the kinsman. That's the close relative, the one who comes and he rescues his close relative who is at risk. He buys up their debt. He frees them and rescues them. And that's what God promises to be. Here's the reason why when we look at man's view of justice, and I should have clicked through that. Wicked men hate justice. We know that. But what's the real ultimate promise is that God will bring justice. Right? God is the Redeemer. He's the one who will guarantee that justice is done. So again, does that mean we just wash our hands of it? All right, well, God will deal with it. We don't have to worry about it. No, the book of Proverbs teaches us we need to be engaged in this process. We need to be pursuing justice, standing up for what's right, standing against that which is wrong. At the same time, we need to find comfort in the fact that God has promised that He will do justice. He is the Redeemer. He is the one who will care for and plead the case of those who are weak, of those who are vulnerable. And so we can trust Him.